Welcome to our latest episode of the Lebanese Physicians Podcast. And today we'll be unraveling the cause of autism, genetics, environment, and beyond with Dr. Mary Boustany, Professor of Pediatric Neurology and Chief of the Division of Pediatric Neurology at the UB Medical Center in Beirut, Lebanon. Welcome, Dr. Boustany, to the podcast.
Thank you.
Dr. Boustany, could you start by sharing your journey in pediatric neurology and what drew you to focus, or to make part of your focus, I guess, autism research?
Okay. So my journey started when I was a child, and my late father, who was a physician, never saw us. So on Sundays at the time, they did house calls. So he'd take my twin sister and me along. And as he took care of the patient, the lady of the house usually gave us candy and chocolates. So I think this had an impact on what I decided to do with my life. I think so. And then it led to medicine. And my love for neuroscience and neurology began when I was a first-year medical student. We had outstanding professors, the late Dr. Adel Afifi, who taught us neuroanatomy. He was also a neurologist. Dr. Fouad Sabra, the late Dr. Fouad Sabra, who was an adult neurologist. And of course, what sealed the deal was a visit from the late father of adult and pediatric neurology, Dr. Raymond Adams, who came and gave grand rounds. And I was enamored of the field. And I was struck when I did my training in pediatrics at AUB that there was a dearth of pediatric neurologists. In fact, the people who would come and see our cases were very knowledgeable adult neurologists. So I decided in my brain, I love neurology, I love neuroscience, but I have to focus on pediatric neurology. And of course, I like working with children, find them slightly easier than adults to work with. So that's the beginning of the journey. I did pediatrics, I then went to Mass General and did adult and pediatric neurology. And at the time, or one of the lecturers was Jim Guzella, who identified the gene for Huntington's disease. And he was a frequent lecturer. He was a junior scientist at the time. And I decided that, genetics, neurogenetics was a very interesting field. And then one event which made me feel, it was towards the end of my training at Master, made me feel that I couldn't just start my clinical practice in neurology, because I had a very complex case in the emergency room, pediatric emergency room, of a little boy who couldn't see, who was superbly intelligent. And we did an MRI that showed numerous abnormalities, but he also would not let me touch him. And I was flummoxed. And the next morning, the late Dr. Adams, the grandfather of all neurology, was whizzing by me in the hallway. And I said, can I just ask you about the case? And I had barely said that the patient didn't let me touch him. And he said, oh, this is Fabry's disease. So my fate was sealed. And after I finished my training in pediatric neurology, I also did a fellowship with Edwin Kolodny at the Shriver Center for Mental Retardation. And my love for genetics was enhanced even more. And I had the opportunity to do research projects with Jim Guzella, Zandra Brakefield, Marcy McDonald, and a lot of other people. And I pride myself on having started the first neurogenetics clinic at the Mass General Harvard Medical School. And subsequent to that, at some point, I felt that I had to leave Harvard and go somewhere else, because I would run into the older professors, even though I was already assistant professor, and they'd ask me, where are you in your training now? So I felt moving would be a good thing. I moved to Duke, and it was probably one of the best moves, because it established me and gave me the freedom to become a student again. And I was an attending at Duke, but I did a molecular biology fellowship during the months that I wasn't on service with Kuni Suzuki at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I barely did a year with him. And the division chief, the late division chief at the time at Duke, flew this thing and he said, here, apply. And I said, what do you mean apply? And he says, it's the Merck Foundation and they're giving a lot of money. All it takes is one letter. Write a letter. I wrote a letter and I was handpicked to go to New York and do an interview. And I had already become very interested in neurodegenerative disease, inherited causes in children. And the division chief at Mass General, who also was my division chief at Duke, was an expert in autism. And actually, at the time, I have a horrible admission. I said, I never want to take care of these children. It's too difficult. And then when I came to Lebanon, I was shocked at how little was available for the families. Even finding therapists for them was like an impossibility. Like there was an hour from Beirut, and by the time I made contact with him or her, say, oh, they've emigrated. So I put in my mind that AUB lacks a place where we can take care of pediatric neurology cases and developmental neurology cases, and that I needed to do something. And it took me a few years to convince the administration. I had to write a business plan. Of course, I have no idea about business, but I did, and I decided I started very small to convince them that they weren't going to lose money. And we started the AUBMC Special Kids Clinic. And now more than 50% of the patients we see are on the spectrum. And I was one of the first clinicians here who introduced the ABA, or Applied Behavior Analysis, in the care of children. And of course, that with other early interventions was revolutionary. And of course, still our patients here, we are not a very rich country. Our patients and families struggle in coming up with the money to pay for a lot of things that are not covered by Social Security in Lebanon, and not even by private insurance companies, for speech, behavioral therapy, occupational therapy, and what have you. And it led to a study that I conducted with the wonderful neuroradiologist here, Dr. Rula Hourani, trained at Hopkins. And I told her, I've read that there's a couple of papers that show there are white matter changes in the brain that the normal MRI does not pick up. So we did this incredible study where only in Lebanon you could do this. I say this sadly, where we had children on the spectrum, and the parents would refute the diagnosis, didn't refuse therapies, and others who immediately wanted therapies. And we did MRIs at the onset of diagnosis and 1 year after therapy. And in about 17% of, I don't know how many we started out with, had these white matter changes seen by diffusion tensor imaging. And then the ones that had received therapy, these changes that affected the microstructure of the white matter had improved neuroradiologically. Of course, my goal was to convince the government and insurance companies to start paying for such therapies. And my mantra was, would you withhold insulin from a diabetic? Look what we are not giving to our little patients. We're still, the jury is still not out on that, but at least it's a beginning. And I am happy that we are able to offer patients, and it brings me great pleasure that other centers in Lebanon and outside Lebanon, in our region, in the Middle East, in the Gulf, are emulating the kind of multidisciplinary clinic that I started. And here I have to give credit to my late division chief, George Robert DeLong, who was enamored of autism as a pediatric neurologist, who, by the way, had trained as an adult neurologist. And later on, Margaret Bowman, who was one of the attendings at Mass General, who dedicated all her research on the neuropathology of the brain in autism. They had a huge impact on me and how I thought about these things. And trying to think, 2010 or 2011, I embarked on this project where they started describing genes in the West, particularly in the US, that accounted for some families of autism, involving SHANK3 and CNTNAP. So my first order of business was to take these genes and check for them in like 47 families on the spectrum in Lebanon. And to my great disappointment, none of the genes that were relatively common as causing autism in the West occurred here. In fact, we found one, we got very excited. I think it was the CNTNAP2 gene. And then when we investigated the normal population, we saw that what we had identified was actually a normal variant in many Lebanese. So that's when I said, okay, now time to really start looking for novel genes that affect the Lebanese population. And we have identified 3, one of which is published. The second is about to be published, and work on the third is very advanced. And I continue. This is the library of the Division of Pediatric Neurology, and I pride myself that all the pediatricians at AUB and the trainees, both in pediatric neurology and pediatrics, are very well versed in recognition of autism early on. And that is a key thing, because even though autism is primarily genetic, but there is an influence of the environment, and that it comes from two things that are very important.
So
First,
as we embark on this question, I'm just going to, it's a good segue because I wanted people to know, because autism is a spectrum, right? So how
yes,
do you, because some people I think have it in their minds, like autism is like severe autism, but it's a complete spectrum and you have to recognize it early. So just briefly, how do you diagnose it and when should you think that the person has
sure.
autism?
Okay, so a typical story, classic textbook, is you have a very healthy child, walks, begins to talk, is, developing and eating. All of a sudden, this magic age, 18 months to 2 years, they start wanting to spend time alone. They lose eye contact. The few words that they have started using stop. And that's when pediatricians in particular should really be alert. And the parents frequently, they seek the opinion, and the pediatrician blows them off, said, oh, some kids don't talk until they're 3 or 4. And the reason that's very important is that, of course, studies have shown that the outcome of patients on the spectrum can go from very severe, where in spite of everybody gets better, everybody on the spectrum gets better, but you have a subgroup that don't improve as much as they could have. This window of opportunity between the ages of 2 and 5 is crucial. So giving treatments, which is environment, early on has a huge impact on the brain and synapse formation. And most of the genetic defects actually occur in synapse proteins or neurotransmitters, or even higher up in the hierarchy of molecules, where you have like key transcription factors that affect the expression of many, many genes. So it's very important to recognize this so you can intervene through the environment to impact this disease. So the other study that was it's a study where there was this idea that prematurity and complicated birth, and you look at those kids, there's a higher incidence of autism. And I can't remember the name of the author. I'm at that age where names just go away. So this group looked at a group of, let's say, I'm going to give an example, 100 families with autism that had no birth complications, no infection, nothing. And then they looked at another 100 where they had a genetic cause. The others had the genetic cause. The genetic cause, in addition, complications at birth. And they found that the way it was very interesting. So you had a higher incidence of autism in those who had the genetic predisposition. And there was those who just had an infection, maybe a little bit, but not really. But when they had both, the incidence was really high. So this is again where the environment, and here are the womb of the mother, what occurs at birth, the prematurity, all of that has an impact. That's the environment having an impact on the brain and affecting autism.
So basically what you're saying is the cause, from what I'm getting from you, is the cause of autism are a lot of causes, but if we want to simplify them, it's environmental, what happens in the womb of the mother, and then early intervention maybe. And
you can't. So these are the environmental factors that affect the outcome. All kids on the spectrum. We've found that there's over 150 mutations now that account for it. But also, the certain things that the parents can do to the environment to enhance outcome. For example, the development of speech. Before I say that, I need to say that below an IQ of 70, the outcome is not as good as those kids who have an IQ 70 and above. And I'm only talking about kids on the spectrum. But at the same time, certain things, like screen time, in Australia, they've gone like way overboard. They forbid the use of tablets and phones before the age of 14 years, which is ridiculous. But the American Academy of Pediatrics says, we shouldn't use tablets and phones before the age of 4. And all over the world, parents, caregivers use the phone and tablets and TV as a babysitter, and there's been, I mean, it's bad for all kids, but if you compare, and we have one of our occupational therapists who's now in Canada, Elisa Salemi, who did a study where we looked at the impact of screen time in those who have autism and those who don't have autism. And it's much worse in those who have autism. So it's an added factor from the environment that can make things worse and impact outcome.
Yeah, so basically environment and genetics. And
Yes.
but one thing I'm going to get is not all patients with autism. I mean, maybe all of them have some genetic mutation, but we have not discovered all the mutations. So some people.
Of course not. Of course not.
Right.
And it's sometimes like, it's been disappointing. So one of the first things you have to do before you can get something published is you have to show that it segregates correctly in the family. It has an impact on the biology of the cell, blah, 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 all of that. But it's important. And it was very disappointing to me that, like we found our first gene, we got very excited. This is novel Lebanese autism gene. We screened all 47 families. It was one family. And the 2 subsequent mutations we found, and we have proven that it is correct and it is causing, we have one family of each. So the number of mutations are diverse. Now we're kind of interested more in maybe looking at further downstream, and maybe there are hubs of gene collections or mutation collections that may look the same once you look at protein and RNA expression. And this came about because the 3 genes we identified, it was maybe just coincidence, affected the protein degradation system in cells. And I said, well, let's look at gene expression and see what's common between these 3 completely different genes. One was X-linked, the other 2 were autosomal recessive, have nothing to do with each other. One affects a certain part of the proteasome, the other a different one. What we found is that when you look lower down, sometimes the impact on gene expression is the same. So we have this crazy idea that maybe we can identify, especially, people are always asking, do you have a drug? And we say, no, we don't have a drug. And this is very important. Now we're going to have to talk about something I didn't want to talk about, but we have to, is that you like for the diseases, for the defects we have discovered, we found one medication that can work in that family if started early enough, but it's not going to fix every family. So the hope is that irrespective, you have this thing at the end where connectivity in the brain is impacted, and maybe there will be something other than the actual environmental change of therapy and early intervention that can have an impact. But that's like a pipe dream to find something that has this effect. Nobody's found it yet, irrespective of the importance and the hierarchy of the people who say it, who are not in science and who are not in medicine. And you know what I mean.
Yeah. Well, what you're saying is probably there could be a common pathway at the end, because there's like so many genetic mutations discovered worldwide right now, and maybe some genes are specific to certain families in certain countries and not in other countries, but maybe we can find something for the end point of the pathway that we can alter it and be able to treat multiple families at the same time.
Yes. And something, at least for our part of the world, and this is something very well, not just Lebanon, but the whole region, is that we have a very high rate of consanguinity. And that has been definitely associated with some studies we've done here in Lebanon and in other Arab countries, where the rate of autism and consanguinity are kind of related. Just like we know that in families with autism worldwide, if you investigate presence of another diagnosis such as schizophrenia or bipolar illness, there is a higher incidence in the expanded families of children who are on the spectrum for these disorders. So, there is a lot of interconnectivity.
Right. And this brings me to now, there's also some talk, like a lot of talk saying, oh, autism is now diagnosed more often in multiple countries and stuff like that. So what do we currently know about the global prevalence of autism? And is it really going up in diagnosis? And if so, what is leading to this?
Very hot field. First of all, there's 3 things that have a huge impact on that. One is the fact that, and that's studies that have been done in the US and in Europe. Like if you go to in Lebanon, we proved that if you go to places where there's more diagnostic centers for autism or neurodevelopmental problems, you will find a higher incidence because there's a higher incidence of recognition. Also, now, like when my father was my late father was a physician, if the doctor said something, oh my God, you have to like genuflect. But now parents are very critical and highly educated and older. And that's another thing, that older parents than people are having kids at a later age in life may have something to do with it. And they go and they investigate on their own, and they keep going until somebody tells them, yes, your son or daughter are on the spectrum, on the autism spectrum. So that's important. The other thing is the impact of gender. So if you look worldwide, the impact of gender is 4 males to 1 female. And there are many reasons for that, but it's very interesting because in Lebanon, it's less than that. And why is it less than that in Lebanon? Not because there isn't a female protective effect, because there is, and some people work on that. I don't, but we've seen it. The reason for that is that in Lebanon and Syria and Iraq, and there is such high consanguinity that for autosomal recessive causes of autism, it's higher. So the male to female incidence isn't 4 to 1. It's more like 2.5 to or 3 to 1. So this again, reinforces the genetic causes and that the fact that consanguinity, and we did a study with Monique Shaya from the Department of Public Health, where we went door to door. We did the traditional in the north, in the south, and we found that again in those places where there's a higher congregation of tertiary hospitals, pediatric neurologists, etc., you have a higher rate of diagnosis.
Right.
And we found the impact of consanguinity, family history of mental illness, complications at birth, prematurity, bleeding. All of these had an impact on the prevalence of autism in our tiny little country.
Exactly. And this is actually was going to be my next question, but I think we answered part of it, is to what extent do cultural, medical, and diagnostic differences influence how autism is reported in different.
Exactly.
And that's
Exactly.
I think we just answered that question right now.
Yeah. With one additional thing, if a boy, it's described in textbooks, a boy lines up his cars and turns the little car around and spins the wheel. Oh, that's a sure sign of autism. But if a little girl lines up her dolls, it's considered, this is a natural thing. But no, it's not. So the disease manifests itself slightly differently, like many other diseases. And response to drugs, for example, chemotherapy in men and women is not the same because there are gender differences.
Right, exactly. I mean, like you're saying, gender differences, even in cancer or in COPD or other diseases, each patient has their own characteristics now. We know that, and the different drugs work differently on these patients too.
Yeah.
So what are some of the strongest genetic associations identified so far? And what do they teach us about brain development?
Well, brain development is, for those of us who remember our embryology lessons, it begins the first few weeks of life, and then you have things that can go wrong, for babies who are born with anencephaly, etc. There's a period for the insult to occur during pregnancy, and for neuronal connections, it continues until much later in pregnancy. So, for example, the intake of antibiotics, this is one of the things, intake of antibiotics during pregnancy per se, it doesn't lead to autism, but those mothers have had infection. So infection in pregnancy. So, and you have to, the ethnic diversity that we're seeing, and I think another person of Lebanese descent who is a geneticist, Maria Shahrour, she's actually focusing on Africa. So she, I'm sure she's going to find genes that haven't been found elsewhere. So including, this begs for inclusion of looking at autism in different ethnic populations, even though the Lebanese are a mixture, but any society is a mixture. But so it behooves us to look at multiple ethnic or ethnicities because there is a different interplay. It's still environment and genetics, but it's a different interplay in different areas of the world.
That's a good point you bring. A couple of podcasts ago, I did a podcast with Dr. Pierre Zalloua talking about genetics in the Levant area and how the movement of people has affected that. So I think that's part of it too, is we're all interconnected somehow. So you're going to find
Yes,
certain genes
yes.
interconnected. So the next question I have for you, which is a big one right now, but what are the biggest misconceptions about the causes of autism that
Okay.
you would like to correct?
The worst, and even though the physician who came up with it was put in jail in the United Kingdom, Wakefield, who came up with the idea that vaccine, particularly MMR, causes. In fact, the CDC and the WHO, there's been studies that have included more than 35,000 cases where they have, without doubt, completely disproven the link of vaccination to autism. In spite of that, we have some very highly educated people in our community in the US and in the UK that absolutely refuse to have their children vaccinated. And of course, we're seeing this horrific increase in measles, mumps, etc., which can have devastating impact on the brain. That's, to me, that's the worst misconception. And when I'm asked, I get very upset and I say, absolutely not. Our autistic kids need to get vaccinated. We have even physicians who have like one child, or, in academic communities that say, well, I don't want to give any vaccines to. That's the worst. That's the worst misconception. That there's the other thing, the dietary conception, that if you completely exclude any milk products, casein, and you put them on this very restricted diet, that they are going to improve. That's been shown to be wrong. Of course, I mean, there are conditions where excluding something from the diet because of the underlying genetic defect may be helpful, but you can't do that. And I keep begging parents, I say, there's so little in the life of these kids, don't limit. I mean, basically, the child, once they are able, like you say, you can't have any gluten, you can't have any bread. The minute their mother isn't there, they will steal the bread and they will eat. And this is another misconception that bothers me. Not that there aren't some metabolic causes, which, like, diabetic needs to watch their sugar intake in addition to getting insulin, which brings me to this other unmentionable thing about glucovorin that I'm happy to discuss, where there's of course a very legitimate use of glucovorin in rescue and cancer treatment. And there is an actual genetic disorder of brain folate deficiency where glucovorin has been shown to be helpful. Now, this group of disorders, it's not a group, it's a kind of disorder where you have I keep forgetting, FLOR1 gene defective. And in those kids, for sure. But it doesn't mean that you're going to give leucovorin to every child on the spectrum and they're going to get better. It's only those kids who have this genetic defect. And then, the others who favor the leucovorin theory and they want to expand the availability of leucovorin. And we are here. It's made our life a nightmare. I say the only way that you can prove this disease is you have to do a genetic test, which costs thousands of dollars in our country and even more in the US. And you have to do a spinal tap to look at the metabolites. And some mothers say, I don't care. I wanted to do it anyway, and the cost is prohibitive and it's not going to work. So, let me put it this way. If I wanted to become very rich, I'd certainly go to the president of the US and say, please teach me how to become rich. They should put a little more trust in what neuroscientists and physicians have been observing and collecting information about these things. Nothing would make me happier that there is a magic something and you can give it and the kids, the autism will disappear. But there is no such thing. And maybe we'll work towards something like that, but we're definitely not there yet. Not that the only thing that I find good is that it's raised concern about autism and that we need to pay attention, but not so sure that I accept. I mean, even the FDA has tried to be very careful in how they word things, that, okay, if you have brain folate deficiency, it can help. And it actually only helps the autistic feature of that disease, not everything else. So that even there's a company that have come up with a medication which is based on leucovorin called Welcovorin, which targets those kids who have this disease who also have autism. So you have to be very careful. And I get really upset with these, not just for this disease, but any genetic disease where kid families jump on the bandwagon. But, they have hope, and they hope that someone can come up with something as simple as a pill or something you can inject that is going to make things better. The other thing, I never mind, I'm going to use this Arabic term because I like it. In the villages, in the mountains of Lebanon, they say something about stroke, that is لا تعالج, meaning, you can't really treat a stroke. And the brain, unlike the liver, where you can have you have much more regeneration. You have a little bit of regeneration in the brain, but once you have this big scar somewhere or cells that have not communicated, and you are beyond the developmental stage where you can impact synapse formation, what the hell are you doing? What are you trying to give a very expensive drug which also has side effects? And so there's a very weak. It definitely works in those that have the genetic defect that causes brain folate deficiency. But now there's others that are saying maybe there are minor forms of it where there are antibodies to the folate receptor, and these have symptoms of autism. Well, those studies have not been done yet. And in fact, the total number of families that have been looked at that have shown benefit, I think there are 46 or 48 families, I forget, had brain folate deficiency. So for me, until they can really convince me, I'm not going to let every patient say, I want access to this drug. That's really against everything that I have studied my entire life.
Right, as we discussed, because it works only for a specific set of patients, not for all comers with autism.
Absolutely.
Which brings me to now, how can understanding, because now we know that the causes are genetic and environmental, and how can understanding the causes of autism improve early diagnosis and then maybe intervention? And that brings me to ask you a question: how important is early recognition and intervention?
Very. There is the other kind of controversy in autism, and some of the patients, there are some patients that are said to be mildly affected and they have Asperger's. So they don't get diagnosed early. In fact, they get diagnosed late. Why? Is because their speech development is okay, but every other aspect, the repetition, the restricted interest, psychological, it's all there. And these kids sort of fall through the sieve and they don't get the attention they deserve early on, and they have higher rates of suicide and higher rates of depression, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very important to recognize it early. And I think social media and the access of people to social media, even if they live in a tiny little village in the Himalayas, they can think for themselves. And early intervention, because we have this window of opportunity where all kids on the spectrum get better, and you can start therapy and they will continue to do better. But the most effective time to start the early intervention is when the brain is still malleable and you can change the plasticity. It's still plastic. So you can still manipulate the connections. So this is it.
Exactly. So, and what gaps in research do you think are most urgent to address in the next decade?
One of them, actually, a couple of them, we've already, access to prenatal care, access to care in general. That's like the biggest. Access to prenatal care, because preventing infections, preventing prematurity, or handling it correctly has an impact. Treatment of infections, and recognition, early recognition. These are the biggest. I mean, lots has been published about it, but it still hasn't entered the psyche of insurance companies and governments, and then it's important because this is the other fact that's very important to bring up. Those that have the ability to improve a lot, we have a subgroup of kids, 37%, if we recognize them early and they're on the milder aspect of the spectrum, and you give them adequate therapies, they will join a regular school, they will join the workforce, they will cost governments much less money in the distant future. And not paying attention to that is basically stupid, because it's one way of controlling the cost. They want to control cost of providing early intervention. Well, in 15 years, this kid is going to be without a job and nobody to support them. And if you're not live in a country like Sweden or Norway or whatever, then what have you done? You've added another person to the people who are homeless and who live on the street. And then there are, all these examples of really very smart people like Einstein and Steve Jobs and certain actors and actresses who are on the spectrum who've done very well for themselves. And it's one of the things, I shouldn't say it, but, I have access. A lot of people come to me where the parents are academics from multiple universities, even from abroad. And it's really very funny because they say, no, there's nobody has anything in the family, anything like it. Usually there is also a higher history of autism in a family. And usually when typically the father goes out of the room to answer a business call, the wife tells me he's actually asocial and he's very shy. So something that we know is a lot of these, what we call core domains of autism, like shyness, not being terribly sociable. The parents frequently, one or the other, not just males, the females as well, they manifest a lot of it also.
Right. And these are probably on the milder spectrum,
Yes.
but long time
Yeah.
ago, we never used to diagnose them because probably they were born never
Yes.
diagnosed.
I know physicians hate when I bring it up, but I think every successful person needs to have some autistic features. And there used to be a scale that you could go online and take, because imagine a child who can focus completely. These are the kids who can be sitting in a room where kids are killing each other, but they are sitting there reading. So there is an element of some of the features of kids on the spectrum that are needed to succeed in life.
Right, because it's
Like
different.
that.
They do things differently and they succeed at exactly. That's
Neurodiversity, the other, this thing which we never talk about, that, some kids are just different. They're better at data collection. There are positive things. They are very honest individuals, very loyal. They have a lot of positive things. And of course, there's been these movements where Microsoft and others hire them, like in the gaming industry, because they're pretty good at doing certain. They may not have a girlfriend, they may not be very sociable, but some of them are quite smart and can become productive. And that's an opportunity that should not be missed.
right, because if they like the thing they're doing, they might be very good at it without any thing to move their attention. So, Dr. Boustany, this was a great conversation, and I think we discussed autism, the prevalence, the diagnosis, the factors that actually cause it, such as the environment, genetics, not vaccines, and potentially the importance of early recognition and treatment. In closing, how can listeners follow your work and learn more about the latest research in autism?
Okay, so thank God for social media. I also have to say that when I first came to Lebanon, I lived a long time in the US. I spent, I don't know, 27 years or so of my life there. And the actual impossibility of access, not even I'm talking about upper middle class. The cost for caring for a child with autism is humongous. Okay. So that led me, and I was approached by a mother. I'm going to mention her. I'm sure she won't mind. The mother of an autistic child. She had been in Paris and she came to Lebanon. She said, whatever you want to do. And I was still in the process where I was trying to convince AUB to let me start a special clinic. I will help you. And we founded together with her an organization called openmindslebanon.org. And they raise enormous funds and they help pay for diagnosis and providing care. Of course, the board, I have nothing to, I'm not on the executive board, but it has allowed me to help patients that otherwise I would not have been able to help at all. We have, in Lebanon, we have this multi-tier society where you have people who are, very poor wage earners, and it can make a huge difference providing them with this help. The other thing, especially in these deprived situations, providing access to actually going to a nursery, which would be enriching for the child. And openmindslebanon.org is such an organization. And we go around begging people for money, and we have been in existence. We started in November 2012, and we started raising money in 2014, and we've helped over, I think, close to 800 families on the spectrum. and other genetic disorders, because I insist that the others also deserve help. But more than 50% of the patients who receive financial help are the ones on the spectrum, because it costs so much, and insurance companies don't pay for most of the services.
Right, because early treatment is very intensive and time consuming and cost consuming. And that's where the importance of the community support is important. Thank you, Dr. Boustany. That was a great podcast.
I have to ask you one thing, which if my students or anyone want to see this, what could you send me something? I can get a link that they can go to listen.
Of course. Yes, this will be downloaded on, I'll send you all the links, but it will be downloaded on YouTube and on all the podcast apps, on Spotify, Apple, and Rami, on all the podcast apps.
If you can send me that, because they asked me and I said, I didn't ask, I'll ask.
Yes.
You can email me. I'd be very grateful. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Bye.